Let's now look at the impact the Millennium Drought had on Melbourne's livability. Professor Tony Wong has proposed a definition of livability of an urban area in terms of its comfort capacity. And based on Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, which we'll discuss in more detail in session 6, the idea of comfort could be categorised in terms of, firstly, existence or basic survival needs, relatedness or the desire to belong, and perhaps most fundamental of all, growth or self-actualisation needs. In terms of how these needs relate to water systems, existence needs can be assessed in relation to a number of factors. For example, water supply security, public health, for example, safe drinking water being provided, public safety, for example, ensuring urban areas are free from flooding, and economic activity, that is, cities are productive. In terms of relatedness or belonging, water systems need to provide for recreational activities, comfort in times of extreme heat waves, and the ecological health of waterways. And when it comes to human needs related to growth, urban water systems planning need to be undertaken in a way where citizen participation ensures a shared vision for the city and intergenerational equity. The Millennium Drought impacted on all of these areas. In relation to recreation opportunities, the impact on parks and gardens was quite significant. Ian Shears, who was responsible for Melbourne's parks and gardens at this time, explains.
The City of Melbourne faced enormous challenges as a result of the Millennium Drought, and what became foremost in our minds was the lack of resilience of our city and our complete dependence on one source of water, the dam system. And historically, the landscapes of the City of Melbourne were developed, had grown, had evolved with copious quantities of water. We'd never faced the shortage of water in the way that we did through the Millennium Drought. That, combined with the excessive heat and the complete lack of soil moisture, transformed our landscapes from one of significant contribution towards the livability of the city to a space where we were losing trees that were 120 years old. These were assets which were irreplaceable. We had to dramatically change the way we were thinking, the way we delivered water, the way we maintained our gardens, and the cultural perspective of the role of the landscapes came to life in a way that it hadn't previously. We'd moved from a heritage or amenity perspective to one to see that the green infrastructure of our city is essential for the livability.
The prolonged drought and relentless hot spells also impacted on public health in a way that had never been experienced before, as outlined by Professor Nigel Tapper.
There's no doubt that the Millennium Drought was a massive natural disaster in Australia in the first decade of this century. But while there were some undoubted massive negatives, there were also some positives I'll briefly talk about in a minute. You will have heard others talking about some of the issues around tree health and so on, but there were also some really significant impacts relating to human health and also to forest fires. Just as an example, the 10 years of the Millennium Drought dried up the soil moisture to such an extent that it allowed air flowing over the surfaces from Central Australia to heat up terrifically. So in some of the heat waves that developed toward the end of the Millennium Drought, in the last summers of the Millennium Drought, particularly the summer of 2009, we had some extraordinarily high temperatures. In Melbourne, the temperature rose to 48 degrees centigrade, and we had several weeks of extreme heat. In one of those heat episodes at the end of January 2009, 374 people died in Melbourne alone from excessive heat. Most of those people were elderly folk who were vulnerable, living in difficult circumstances and so on, but that was a terrible loss of life. A week or so later, we had the Black Saturday bushfires, and the Black Saturday bushfires took another 173 lives. So all in all, there were 500 plus people that died as a direct result of the Millennium Drought in and around Melbourne. So these were some terrible things that were happening, and of course toward the end of the drought, both Brisbane and Melbourne were virtually out of water. But on the other hand, there were some really interesting positives that came out of this drought, because the public were alerted to the fact that something strange was going on with the climate. They linked this millennium drought to climate change, and so there was a gradual increase of pressure on the then government to do something about it. So ultimately, this had a part to do with the difficulties the Howard government found itself in. And then, of course, the Rudd government was elected, and one of the first things they did was ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So that really important piece of climate change international legislation would probably not have been ratified by the Australian government if it hadn't been for the Millennium Drought. But in addition, the interest or the concern about climate and heat and the drought caused people to think really seriously about what was needed to mitigate and adapt to these climate extremes. So, for example, a number of major initiatives took place at the state level to develop heat watch plans, to develop climate change adaptation plans. And of course, the CRC for water sensitive cities was funded very soon after the end of the Millennium Drought, and it's highly unlikely that it would have been funded if it hadn't been for the drought causing these massive pressures on our political system.
It could also be said that the extreme conditions experienced during the Millennium Drought had major impacts on ecological health of waterways and the levels of flooding.
During the Millennium Drought, our parks and green spaces were clearly suffering terribly, but it wasn't just our parks and green spaces, it was our waterways. And the government received advice from an expert panel that the Yarra actually needed more environmental flows, in fact 17 gigalitres. But that water couldn't be provided because we simply had to prioritise human needs over ecological needs at that time. But it was not just about the environmental flows per se, it was also that we were experiencing a number of very localised flood events, very significant flood events, which saw very high volumes of runoff into our waterways. And what that meant is pollutants, litter, and in fact even the volume and speed of the runoff caused great ecological damage.